We've talked a little bit about the infrastructure crises in Indigenous communities, but I need to sort of put, I guess, a human face on this. And there are a lot of sort of other crisis moments that we can kind of look at across this sort of lived experience of Indigenous Canadians that sort of really drive home why, for example, those infrastructure crises are really hard to solve because there isn't sort of a number of other things going on, but also how those infrastructure crises are connected to sort of what people actually live and what they do. So one of the things that we should talk about sort of initially um, is things like an incarceration rate. So Indigenous Canadians represent about 4% of the Canadian population. And that's okay, that's what it is. But they are 23% of the federal inmate population, which means that Indigenous Canadians are almost 6 times as likely to be sort of represented in the prison population than they are in the general population. This is connected to a number of different things. So we could talk about all kinds of things like prejudice and sort of discrimination from lawyers, from police officers, from social workers, from sentencing in judges, all of those sorts of things. And all of those people are human, so they are like they can be discriminatory in the same way as anyone else can. Um, but there's also sort of some relationship issues in that. So, for example, if you know that sort of piece, right? Like if you are an Indigenous person and 23% of the federal inmate population is Indigenous, you probably know someone who's in jail. Whether that's sort of how many degrees apart that is a sort of a different question, but you probably know someone who is in prison. And you are much more likely to have had somewhat negative interactions with police officers, which means you're less likely to sort of trust the police in the first place, right? So there's some tensions there. You see actually very similar things when we talk about academic achievement, right? If you or members of your family went through residential schools, why on earth would you ever trust a teacher who calls you in and say, "I think we need to have a meeting. We need to talk about what's happening with your son." You're just going to be like, you're not going to trust that person, and you're not going to be open with them, and you're not going to sort of view them as a partner in sort of your child's education, which is a view of teachers, for example, that is much more common among sort of white middle class parents, which is an unfortunate barometer, but it's the one everyone uses, which is the same, for example, as the ability to call the police and expect them to help you, right? So there's that sort of challenge. Connected to specifically, in a lot of ways, those sort of community amenity infrastructure pieces. We also can talk about sort of suicide as a personal or health crisis in Indigenous communities. So Indigenous Canadians are about twice as likely as everyone else, as non-Indigenous Canadians, I suppose is the way to put it, to report suicidal ideation, so thinking about suicide at some point in their lifetime. These numbers are much higher in the northern part of the country, so the territories are worse for this sort of issue. There's 5 to 6 times more suicides among Aboriginals than there are for non-Aboriginal men. The numbers are a little bit different for men and women, but 5 to 6 times more completed suicides. That's what my friends who are therapists say. It's completed suicides. In Indigenous people than for non-Indigenous people, and this is connected to a lot of different pieces of things like infrastructure crises and that kind of thing. So one of the things that sort of comes with a lack of infrastructure is a lack of mental health resources. So, for example, access to counselors, access to um, therapists, that sort of thing, psychiatrists, depending on what you need. This is also a conversation about access to social workers who can help you do things like navigate systems to reduce stress in your life. So there's that kind of problem. Okay. Then there are also kind of, I almost want to say cultural aspects of this. And I don't mean that from the perspective of Indigenous cultures are connected to suicide. What I mean by that is that one of the things that shows up in the data, if you look at it, is that suicidal ideation and attempting suicide is one of the is connected in a lot of ways to people not feeling like they have control over their life or their situation And for example, if something is bad, that it's not going to be, that they're not going to be able to make it better. There's kind of a learned helplessness that is associated with suicide in a lot of ways like that. And in many ways, that feeling of not being able to control one's own outcome is deeply connected to, for example, a loss of connection with Indigenous cultures. If you don't know who you are, it's really difficult to do that. And I don't sort of want to talk about that in terms of like, here's this monolithic, unchanging idea of Indigenous culture. What I mean is that if you as an individual don't know who you are in relation to the people you define as your community, in relation to the people you define as your family, then you have a really hard time navigating life because you don't have those sort of compass points to tell you if you're going in the right direction. And that's really, really, really important in that sort of process. There's also some conversations about mental health supports and healthy communities, right? In that, in an ideal world, okay, if you're really struggling and you are really stressed and you need something, then a member of your community can usually help you with that. Whether that's providing childcare, bringing over groceries, offering you, like taking you out for dinner, whatever that is, okay, to sort of support you going through that process, which is usually a way of sort of catching mental health challenges early on and sort of providing people with the resources they need to adjust them. But the ability to do that sort of relies on the ability on someone in your community having, I guess, extra resources, whether that's a spare room where the teenager who's stressing you out can stay, or extra money to buy groceries for your household as well as theirs, any number of those things. And if that's not true, if those resources don't exist in your community, then there isn't sort of as smooth of a system to be able to do that. It's not to say it doesn't happen, it's just it's harder. And that means that sort of the unemployment rate, which is higher for Indigenous Canadians than for non-Indigenous Canadians, has lots of sort of knock-on effects, because it means that the people who are closest to you may not be able to help you if something goes wrong. So there's that kind of challenge. We have some pretty serious challenges when we talk about some health conditions. So tuberculosis is probably the best one, although you can find sort of relatively similar numbers for all kinds of things, heart disease, diabetes, that kind of thing. Um, as far as it goes, tuberculosis is not a particularly serious, it's not a thing that most non-Indigenous Canadians think of normally. However, for Indigenous Canadians, the infection rates are something like 290 times higher than in the rest of Canada. This is something that affects especially Indigenous communities in the territories, so in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut, but it affects sort of Indigenous communities across the country. And there is some uncomfortable history around that as well. We don't talk about the tuberculosis hospitals in the same way that we talk about residential schools, but they have a lot of similarities in terms of this is the government removing people from their home communities, telling them it's for their own good, and often the tuberculosis treatment might take years, and you would have, for example, people who died during that treatment and being left in unmarked graves and no one told their families. And these people sort of disappeared for years at a time to tuberculosis treatment. So there are some similarities with that, and there's some really important challenges with that, right? Because if you're talking about removing children from a community, we've talked about what the effects of that might look like for residential schools. But what happens to families if you start removing parents and grandparents and all sorts of stuff for years at a time? There's a lot of sort of instability that comes into the community for that. So tuberculosis is one. We should also probably talk about criminal victimization. So we talked already about incarceration rates in terms of Canadian Indigenous populations in Canada are much more likely to be represented among prisoners than they are in the regular population. And we'll get into this a little bit later on, Aboriginal women are about 3 times more likely than non-Aboriginal women to be the victims of violent crimes. So that includes sexual assault, that kind of thing. And in general, this includes all kinds of things. This sort of criminal victimization includes higher rates of domestic violence, whether those are among sort of Indigenous couples or in Indigenous families or in relationships mixed between Indigenous and non-Indigenous members. So there's that sort of piece. And then there's all of this piece in terms of criminal victimization about the victimization by police and by law enforcement. So in our discussions, we've had some discussions of starlight rides, and for those of you who are not familiar with those, that is sort of a practice that was reported in the late 1990s, I believe, in parts of Saskatchewan where police officers would pick up Indigenous people who were inebriated, who were drunk, um, and drive out to the middle of sort of some farmer's field and have this inebriated Indigenous person get out of the car and tell them to walk home, often in the middle of the winter, often without appropriate protective gear. There's a number of people who died that way. Neil Stonechild is sort of one of the names that will come up in that process. So there's that kind of criminal victimization. There's also some relatively recent discussions out of a place called Val d'Or, Quebec, where there were a number of Indigenous women who reported being pressured to perform sexual favors to avoid getting tickets from getting charged and given tickets by police officers on charges of prostitution or having alcohol in their purse, that kind of thing. So when we talk about criminal victimization, we're not necessarily talking about like random people, we're also talking about sort of people in positions of authority. If you want to dig into it and you sort of want to look at that, one of the things you will also find is, for example, that Indigenous students are much more likely to be suspended from their elementary, junior highs, and high schools. There's all kinds of that sort of thing that comes out of that. And if you want to dig into sort of educational outcomes and sort of talk about what that sort of looks like, that's a great topic for your new information in this place. The other thing that I want to sort of talk about, just again, this is an overview. There's lots of other things we could talk about. I just want to give some sense of the scope of what's happening and the scope of the difference between the lives of Indigenous Canadians and the lives of non-Indigenous Canadians across the country. It's not perfect, there's a lot of details missing, but I want to sort of give some scope. So, as I said last video, Indigenous communities are among sort of the fastest growing in Canada, in that the number of children that Indigenous women have is much higher than the number of children that non-Indigenous women have. So when we talk about, for example, the incarceration rate, Indigenous populations represent 4% of the Canadian population overall. Okay, the Indigenous population is also very young. So Indigenous children are about 7% of the children in Canada. So if you sort of count children under 15, about 7% of them are Indigenous, which is a substantial difference from 4%. So there's that sort of piece, right? There's that piece, but that has some other consequences. Approximately 50% of foster children in Canada are Indigenous, which means that approximately 50% of the children who have been removed from their parents' care or from family care by social workers, by that kind of sort of intervention, are Indigenous. The numbers and the specifics of that vary a little bit by province, so that changes a little bit. But it's also important to understand that many of these children are being placed with non-Indigenous families. They are being placed with whatever families will be able to take care of them, and there's a lot of sort of consequences about that sort of piece. In a lot of ways, this is a continuation of something that we call the 60s scoop, or it is referred to as the 60s scoop, about sort of taking Indigenous children out of their parents' care. But it is definitely still ongoing and definitely still an issue. This is, I remember hearing calls for a study of sort of children in care not too terribly long ago, and we still haven't seen sort of major changes about that. So that's kind of a very brief overview of this. There's a lot more we could say, but I also sort of want to highlight that this is not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of great stories of resilience and stories of sort of building meaningful, useful sort of interventions at the community level that you could also dig into in this space. This is not a series of bad things that happen to Indigenous people. This is sort of a very clear space where something is wrong, but there's also a lot of people who are working to fix it.